I'm going to start us with the sponsors, and then we'll go on. Okay. Okay. A Year of Learning by Sue and Arnie Garelick, in memory of Malka Perlman and Philip Mann, and Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Beryl ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Yosef Meir ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Henya Rivka Perel Barosner Bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, in memory of family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah bat Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Shall share her children and grandchildren. In memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Harav Akiva, Marcia Federbush and family. In memory of her husband, Dr. Oriel Paul Federbush, Oriel Pinchas ben Harav Shimon. Sharon and Fred Lisker, their family and many friends. In memory of her dear mom, Harriet Friedman, Edelbas Yaakov. Leslie and Gail Kaplan. In memory of their parents, Harry and Marjorie Sedell, and Irving and Pearl Kaplan. Friends of Avi Gitler, Avram Meir ben Shimon, and Martha Gitler, Chana bat Yeshaya. Friends of Toby Paris, Sarah Tova bat Yisrael Dove. Friends of Malka Levi, Malka bat Yosef. Friends of Joe Wolf, Yosef ben Chaim. And Month of Learning, Carol and Josh Sanborn, in memory of her mother, Ita bat Nachman ben Yamin. Mel and Haran Haller, in memory of his brother Yaakov ben Avraham. Jill and Perry Meltzer, in memory of his father, David ben Fishel Halevi, and her mother, Bela Bas Avraham. Dov Bodlander, in memory of his wife, Udal Bat Yehuda Tzvi. Also a month of learning by Stephanie and Fred Mortman for the refuah shlema of her daughter, Mazal Bat Sarah Malka. We have a day of learning plus Torah Fund that is for Shabbos, sponsored by Yossi Goldstein, in memory of his mother, Sarah Bat Yosef. And also there was a day of learning on the 15th by Lynn Friedman in memory of her father, Israel Isaac ben Menachem. And that is it for today. Okay. And Shemas have an aliyah, Krank Arafia, Vati Yashir Shematliya, and the Chol Yisrael good ben Shtiyah. Right? Okay. Right, so we're looking at this, Bob. Good. We're looking at the Gemara as it continues on 68a. Okay. And we commented, I think, Marvin, it was you who commented that the word nituach in modern Hebrew refers to surgery, right?
Yeah.
Here it refers to the cutting of the animal as opposed to the skinning of the animal.
Right.
Right? Malahalan al yedei nituach v'lo al yedei hefshet, afkan al yedei nituach v'lo al yedei hefshet. Okay? Now, that should a little bit surprise us, because normally we said the animal is skinned and that the hides usually go to the kohen, right? Depending on what the particular korban is. So the Gemara therefore appropriately asks, V'hata menalan. There, in that example, okay, we have a chatas that belongs to the Kohen Gadol, the par. Okay? So how does that, so there, that's an individual offering compared to the Seir, which is also a chatas, but that's a communal offering, right? And so how is it that these two items may be treated in the same manner? Okay? Tanya says the Braita, v'kirbo ufirso v'hotzi. Okay, implying that what's inside and its excrement are then brought out. Okay, in other words, that which is inside. Milamed shemotzi o shalem, which implies that, says the Gemara, that we're learning that one removes everything, okay, without skinning the animal. Yechol yisrafenu shalem. Therefore, this would seem to imply one could burn up the item in totality. Ne'amar kan rosho ukra'av, v'ne'amar lahalan rosh ukra'av. But elsewhere it says, right here, it says the head and its innards. And therefore, elsewhere, implying that it's the hair and the head and its innards. Namely, malahalan al yedei nituach, afkan al yedei nituach. Okay? And so since the avarim and these other parts are included within the hide, and therefore that's where they learn that comparison. But the Gemara says and continues with this issue. Imalahalan al yedei hefshet, afkan al yedei hefshet. But elsewhere we know that when we make this comparison, this Gezer Shava, we could say if there it applies that there is a requirement of skinning, why isn't here this requirement of skinning as well? Talmud Lomar, Bekir Bo Upir Sho. So here it says clearly what's inside and its excrement. My Talmuda. So how do we interpret this, asks the Gemara. Amar Rav Papa, Kashem Shapir Sho Bekir Bo, Kach Bisaro Be'oro. So Rav Papa's answer is the same way that the dung, the excrement, is inside the inner parts of the animal.
So too the flesh.
The meat, right, is within the hide. And it's in the, right, it's in the flesh, is in the skin, however we want to translate it. Okay, so Rav Papa gives us this explanation as to why, in this case, these particular lot animals are not skinned in advance of their being offered.
Right.
All right, that at least now gives us a reasonable place to move on, says the Gemara, and to continue with a new piece from the Mishnah. And it says, Meimatai mitam'im begadim. At what point, right, is the individual's clothes become tameh, right? Now, what are we saying? Whose clothes? We already dealt with the clothes of the one who brings the mishtaleach, the scapegoat. So now we must be dealing with the individuals who are out,
to
right?
be burned.
Animal parts
To be burned.
The walls of Jerusalem to be burned.
Burned.
Tanu Rabbanan, and a Braita teaches, Yotzi el michutz l'machaneh v'sarfu, that we bring it outside of the camp, all right? This is the wall of the sin offering, goat with its sin offering. The blood was used for the sprinkling, right? So now these animals must be brought outside the camp and burnt. Now, our problem is as follows. Notice it says outside the camp.
Singular.
Right? In singular. So, lahalan noten lehem shalosh machanot. But if we remember, says the Gemara, all right, we have often talked about the fact that when it was in the desert, in the Midbar, Mishkan, there were actually 3 camps, right? One was the camp of the Mishkan itself. A second surrounding that was the camp of the Levi'im. And the third surrounding that was the camp of Bnei Yisrael. And once the Beis HaMikdash was established in Yerushalayim, we'll remember that that parallel was maintained. Okay, one was the Beis Hamikdash in the Azara, is one. The second, okay, was further around, as we're going to see momentarily, and then a third. Okay, so the Gemara is telling us the Halan, okay, elsewhere below, Atonoten lehem shalosh machanot, v'kan atonoten lehem machane achat. And here it seems like there was only one. Okay, right? So what happens? The temple, by the way, in the courtyard was the first. The Temple Mount was the second, Levite camp, and the whole city of Jerusalem was the third. But the implication is all we're doing is taking these animal parts outside the walls of the Beis Hamikdash, or simply outside the wall of Jerusalem itself. Let's go on and see. Im kain, lama ne'amar michutz lamachaneh. If that's the case, why was it simply said outside the camp? Lomar lecha, in other words, to tell you, kivan yatsa chutz lamachaneh achat mitam'in begadim. Once they carry it outside, we'll call it the initial camp, the first camp, outside the walls of the Beis Hamikdash and the Azara, the temple precinct, that's when it becomes Tamei. So the Gemara asks, if that's the case, Vahatam Minalan, on what basis then do we say this? Okay, after all, what about other offerings? Titania, Vahotziet Kol Hapar. Why? Because elsewhere, okay, when it's a bull sin offering, we say it says simply remove the animal. Chutz l'shlosh machanot. We would think that that implies that it has to be outside all three camps, right? However, what happens? Now it says, Ata omer chutz l'shalosh machanot. Do we really say that it means outside all three camps? Oeno ele chutz l'machane achad. Or do we say it only implies outside a camp? Keshehu omer b'par ha'edah, where it says there in the example of the offering, a sin offering there, when it was the par ha'edah, okay, that situation, right? The par ha'edah, remember, was brought if there was a error on the part of the Kohen Gadol or the part of the Sanhedrin. Okay, El michutz lamachaneh, and it says there outside of the camp. She'eim Talmud lomar. Okay, sheharei kvar ne'amar. That seems to be superfluous. It doesn't seem to need to be said. Why? Because we have another pasuk that says, "V'saraf oto ka'asher saraf et apar harishon," that you burn it the same way you burn the first. Umat Talmud lomar el michutz lamachaneh. So therefore, why does it say here outside the camp? Litain lo machaneh shniya. In other words, to tell us, okay, that there is going to be a second camp, and it must be removed beyond that as well. Ukshehu omer michutz lamachaneh badeshen. And when it says to tell us that it has to be removed outside the camp, it also teaches us that it has to be brought to the place where the ash is put. She'eim Talmud lomar, because the text doesn't say Shaharei kvar ne'amar. Why? Because it already has said previously El Shefech Hadeshen, to the place already that has the ash. Ten lo machaneh shlishit. That tells us that it has to go then to be put beyond the third camp. Thus, the Gemara then still hasn't really totally solved the argument. Okay, until we now get to Rabbi Shimon. The Rabbi Shimon says, Hai michutz l'machaneh. When it says outside the camp, what do we do with that? Mai avedle, mibaye le lekedetanya, which required the way we've taught in a Braita. Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Says Rabbi Eliezer, Ne'amar kan michutz l'machaneh. It says here outside the camp. V'ne'amar lahalan michutz l'machaneh. And it says elsewhere also. What was that second case? That was for the red heifer. Makan chutz l'shalosh machanot, af lahalan chutz l'shalosh machanot. So the same way here, okay, the red heifer, right, has to be outside all three camps. So likewise, we're saying the par has to be outside all three camps. Furthermore, Umar lahalan b'mizracha shel Yerushalayim, and likewise, since it has to be on the eastern side of the city, afkan b'mizracha shel Yerushalayim. So here too, it has to be burned on the east side of Jerusalem. Okay. Now, Gemara continues, having proven that the par has to be brought all the way out, then outside the walls of Jerusalem to the Beit Hadeshin, Rabbanan, Heicha Sarif Lahu. They ask the question, then where do they burn it? Kedetanya, Hechan Nisrafim, as was taught in the Braita, where is it burned? We go on to the other next Amud. We see this Braita tells us, Litzfon Asha Yerushalayim. It was burned on the north side of Jerusalem. Right? V'chutz l'shalosh machanot, and outside the three camps. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Abeit Hadeshin Nisrafin. And Rabbi Yossi says, no, it was burned at the place of the ashes. Now, Amar Rabba. Rabba tries to clarify. Man Tana, the Paligale de Rabbi Yossi. Who is the Tana that disagrees with Rabbi Yossi's view? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. It's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the Tanya, who teaches an Abraita, El Shefach Hadeshin Yisaref, that where it says in the pasuk, to the place of the ashes, that's where it will be burned. Sheyehei l'sham deshen, that's where the ashes will be put. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, what does he say? Sheyehei mikomo mishupach, namely, no, that he disagrees and says that is the place, and said that it has to be slanted. In other words, that it's a location where the ashes will roll downhill. Okay. Now, that would be clearly on the side of the mountain, which has to be outside of the walls of Jerusalem. Amar le Abaye. Abaye questions that proof. V'dilma bimkomo mishupachu de lepligi. Maybe they're arguing about this issue of whether the place has to be slanted. Why? We have a Braita that follows, in other words, it's follows. Tanu Rabbanan, says the Braita, Vahaso Reif, namely the one who does the burning, Hasoreif mitame bigadim, v'lo hamatzit et haor, v'lo hamisader et hama'aracha, v'ezehu hasoreif, zeh hamisayeya b'shat sreif. It says, doesn't answer the question of the place, but it continues with a discussion about the person who is doing the burning, and that his clothes become tameh, but not hamatzit et haor, the one who, so to speak, kindled the fire. V'lo hamisader et hamaracha, nor the one who arranges the wood pile for the burning. So who then is the one who actually burns? Zeh hamisayeh b'sha'at sreifa, the person who actually is involved in the actual act of burning during the time it is on fire. So the Gemara says, Yechol af mishene'asu efer metam'in begadim. Maybe we might think that it is also the person whose activity results in that becoming ash, that person's garments also become tameh. Talmud lomar otam. Therefore, the text says them. Otam mitamim begadim v'lo mi shene'asu efer mitamim begadim. Those who are involved in the, let's say, the actual burning, they're the ones whose clothes become tameh, not necessarily the ones who are involved
with the ashes.
in the final act, let's say, of the ash. Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Shimon Omer, hapar mitameh, nitach habasar, eino mitameh begadim. No, he argues and instead says that it's the animal. Anyone involved in dealing with this animal, this par, their clothes become tameh, right? And that's what happens. Okay, but once it's burnt, right, those clothes, that person's clothes does not render him tameh. My benai, who asks the Gemara, so what's the difference between their two views? Ika benaihu, the shavya harucha. What's the difference is that the difference between them is that it's what we have now is left I don't want to call it charcoal, but it's the burnt remains, the charred mess, if you will. That's the difference between them. Okay, so one would argue and say that if that whoever has to deal with that, his clothes don't become tameh. The other would say no, the clothes do become tameh. Right? So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon said, since it's already now totally burnt, okay, that individual who must handle, let's say, that the charcoal, what's left over, his clothes do not become tameh. That has us now stopping that discussion to go on to a new Mishnah. Okay? And we've got to ask, before we jump into this Mishnah, a question. Okay? We saw that there are quite a number of steps, right, involved by the Kohen Gadol for that day. He has sprinkling to do, he has slaughtering the animals to do, he has confession to do, okay? But that's not the only prerequisites, so the only aspects of the day's avoda that he's involved with. So the Mishnah is going to go on and tell us, okay? And by the way, remember it said it had to be done in that set order, okay? And so one of the other things we're going to see that the Kohen Gadol must do is read from the Torah the Torah's description of what happens on Yom Kippur. But he doesn't do that until what I'm going to say, the atonement aspects of the day's events seem to be completed. One of those atonement aspects is clearly, right, the mishtalech, the scapegoat. So how is he going to know, right, at what point that aspect has been fulfilled before he can go ahead and start reading from the Torah? Remember, we saw previously the other day that it said when the crimson strip turned white.
Right.
Okay, and we saw a discussion that said, number one, they used to tie it outside the ulam door, then they had it inside the ulam door, and then eventually they simply gave it to the person taking out the animal, and he would tie part of it to the rock and part of it onto the
The
animal.
hoods.
Okay, he would then see and not report back to the end of the day. Okay,
And smoke signals wouldn't work.
what?
And smoke signals would not work.
Smoke signals wouldn't work. All right.
Yeah.
So maybe they had other signals, right? Let's continue now with the Mishnah and the Gemara so that we understand what happens. Amru lo leKohen Gadol. They said to the Kohen Gadol, Higia Sa'ir Lamidbar. The goat has reached the wilderness. In other words, they've reached the cliff. Uminayin hayu yodim shehigia Sa'ir Lamidbar. And how did they know, says the Mishnah, that they reached the wilderness? Dirkaot hayu osim, that they had raised platforms, okay, along the way. So in other words, maybe those platforms were also the location for the rest stops, right? If you have a raised platform, people could go on top, and underneath you'd have the shade where you could have the rest stop. We don't know, but let's continue. Okay, but through these raised platforms, and what would they do? Uminifin besudarin, they would wave handkerchiefs, cloths, scarves. Okay, v'yodin shehigia sa'ir lamidbar, and that's how they would know, okay, that the goat reached the wilderness. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, says Rabbi Yehuda, v'halo siman gadol hayalehem. Okay? Wasn't that really a worthwhile, a reliable form of indication? Shlosha milim, holchin mil v'chozrin mil v'shohin kedei mil. Okay? We could also figure another way, that there were people who would go 1 mile, 1 meal, with the person taking out the goat. So let's say for a moment, and then there were the same people who would come back to Jerusalem. Okay, so let's say that was a 20-minute walk, just taking a rough guess, right? So that's 20 minutes. And 20 minutes to come back is 40 minutes. And then they would wait another time equivalent to that same time period. Maybe they could do it that way. V'yod'in shehigia sa'ir lamidbar. And then they would know, right, that by that point in time, the goat had reached the wilderness. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, he says, V'halo siman acher hayalehem. Maybe they had a different sign, right? Lashon shel zohorit haya kashur al pitcho shel heichal, right? Namely, that strip of crimson that had been tied to the doorway to the opening of the heichal. Ukshehigia sa'ir lamidbar, Hayahalashon malbin. And when the goat reached the wilderness, it would turn white. Shnema, as the pasuk said, Im yihiyu chata'echem keshanim, kesheleg yalbinim. That if the sins were going to be like scarlet, they will turn white like snow. Okay? Now, problem with Rabbi Yishmael's statement, of course, is that we already know that the rabbis had to make changes in that aspect of the Lashon Shel Zahorit, that strip of crimson. Okay? So that raises some questions about Rabbi Yishmael's answer. So the Gemara, however, wants to tell us the following. Amar Abaye, Shmamina. We can learn from this the following. Beit Chidudo b'midbar kaima. Okay, that was, let's call Beit Chidudo was a location in the wilderness, right? The house of sharpness. In other words, that was theoretically the name of the location to which they would bring the mishtalech, the scapegoat, right? Vahaka mashmalan. And it seems then to tell us the kasava Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda must be of the opinion, kevan shehigia sa'ir lamidbar ne'eset mitzvato, that maybe Rabbi Yehuda must be of the opinion that once you brought the animal there, you fulfilled the mitzvah. Okay? Hadran alach shnei seiri. Now we finish this parak, but we're not finished with our inyan, right? So as we go to the new parak, what happens? We get a new Mishnah. So we don't have a clear clarification at the end of the parak here, okay, how they actually knew. Was it through this Tanakama, who said they used a symbol of let's say, signal flags, so to speak, right? Or did they rely on another issue? Okay. However, as we go to our new Mishnah, okay, what happens? It's going to tell us now, in any case, the Kohen Gadol was signaled at some point to be able to proceed with the next part of the avoda, worship, being the Torah reading. And so this Mishnah now tells us. Okay? And by the way, as we go into this Mishnah, think of the following. Remember that the Kohen Gadol, given various acts that he had to do, had to continue to change garments. Some of them he had to do in the white garments, like the sprinkling in the Kodshe Kadoshim or in the Heichal. Others he had to do wearing the, let's say, full regalia, all the gold garments. Okay. So a worthwhile question that's going to come up is the Torah reading that he's supposed to do now considered one of the set requirements of the avoda? And if so, does it need to be done in the white garments, like the application of the blood? Or does it need to be done in the gold garments? Or doesn't it matter? And therefore the Torah reading is not considered part of the required steps of the avoda on Yom Kippur. Okay, so let's look at this new Mishnah now. Matnitin, says the Mishnah, Balo Kohen Gadol Likrot. The Kohen Gadol comes now to read from the Torah, right? And he's going to read those sections from Vayikra, right, that deal with the days, day service. Imrat Salikrot Bevigdei Boots, if he chooses to read in his white linen garments, Koreh, he may do so, right? Because if not, he has to go through another whole
changing.
etc., right? Ve'im lav, korei be'itz talit, lavan mishalo. And if not, he reads in his own personal, let's say, everyday garment, his everyday white robe. Okay? And that's not considered a priestly garment, a priestly vestment. Now, how is this to be done? Chazan HaKnesset, right? That would be we would consider today what the shamus, the officiant of the synagogue, notel Sefer Torah, but not no the Rosh HaKnesset. He would take the Torah and give it to the head of the synagogue. I guess we would consider that the president, right? V'Rosh HaKnesset, not no Liskan, and the head of the synagogue would give it to the skan, the assistant high priest. V'Haskan, not no the Kohen Gadol, and the skan would then give it to the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol, Omeid Umikabel, right, stands and receives the Torah. The Korei Ba'achrei Mot, Va'ach Ba'asor. And he reads the two sections from the Torah, right? One being Leviticus chapter 16, the other Leviticus chapter 23. Okay?
It sounds like a Torah toss.
A Torah toss? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What?
Right? Well, hold on to that idea. V'golel Sefer Torah umanicho b'cheiko. He would then roll up the Torah, hold it in against his chest. In other words, think of how somebody carries the Torah today. V'omer yoter mima shekarati lifnechem katuv kan. More than what I've read to you is written here. Okay. Ube'asor shebechumash hapkudim korei al peh. And in the section from Bamidbar, from Numbers chapter 29, okay, where it talks all about the holidays, okay, and refers there to Yom Kippur. From that, he recites by heart. Now, one of the side items that make this Mishnah particularly intriguing for the history of Tefillah is it tells us that there was a Beit Knesset, that there was some sort of synagogue in the Beit HaMikdash, in the precinct of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? I'm not going to go into that in detail now, but it is worth keeping that in mind, okay, particularly if we remember some aspects from Masechet Brachot and some other items that we'll come to at other points, okay? However, what happens? He's now read and recited part of the Torah by heart, okay? What then happens is he recites a series of blessings. Umavarecha leha shmona brachot, and he recites 8 blessings. Okay, what are they? Al haTorah, the blessing on the Torah, the al ha'avodah, and the blessing concerning the temple worship, the al ha'hoda'ah, and the blessing of acknowledgement, Va'al mechilat ha'avon, and a blessing acknowledging forgiveness for sin. Va'al hamikdash b'fnei atzmo, excuse me, and on, and on the temple itself. Va'al Yisrael b'fnei atzman, Okay, and on the Jewish people and themselves, right? Va'al Yerushalayim b'fnei atzma, and on the city of Jerusalem in itself, right? Va'al haKohanim b'fnei atzmam, and on the Kohanim, va'al sha'ar hatfilah, and on the rest of the prayer. So if you count all of those up, how many are they? They're actually 9. Okay? So Mefarshim are asking, so why if it says 8 and we have 9 examples, it must mean that certain ones may have been cited together. Okay. However, the Mishnah continues and tells us, Haro'eh Kohen Gadol Kashehu Koreh, those people who were, let's say, in the Azara, in the temple courtyard, okay, who could watch him reading, Eino ro'eh par v'sa'ir hanisrafin. They would not see the bull and the goat being burnt. Remember, because those were being done outside the city wall. V'haro'eh par v'sa'ir hanisrafin. And those who are outside the city wall watching the burning of the bull and the goat. In Gadol Kashehu Koreh. They would not be able to see the Kohen Gadol in his reading. V'lo mipnei she'eino rashai, and it's not because they weren't permitted. Ela shehaita derech rechoka, because there was considerable distance between them. Umalechet shneihen shaveh ka'achad, and the performance of the two of them were done at the same time. It was done simultaneously. Right? So now the Gemara wants to clarify what we just saw in the Mishnah. Okay? Midikatane be'itz talit lavan mishalo, since the Mishnah taught that for reading the Torah he could wear his own white garment, miklau the kriya lav avodahi. We would seem therefore to determine that the reading of the Torah was not considered a required aspect of the temple worship on that day. Vikatani. But it's written in the Mishnah, Imratza lekrot bevigdei butz koreh, that if he wants to read while wearing the white linen garments, he may do so. Shemat mina, that would seem to imply, bigdei kahuna nitnu laheanot bahen, that the priestly garments were such that one could derive benefit from them. Dilma shani kriya, tzorech avodahi. That would seem to imply that maybe what this reading is unique and different, and therefore it does have some aspect of the avoda connected with it. Okay? Now, the Gemara picks up and then tells us the Ibayalan. And this question, this issue was raised as a dilemma, as a question. Big day kahuna, nitnu lehanot behen, o lo nitnu lehanot behen. The clothes of a kohen, are we saying that they're permitted to one to derive benefit from it, or are they not permitted to derive benefit from it? And so we have another text, another braita. Tashma, listen to the following, attempt to come to an answer to this question. Lo hayu yeshenim bebigdei kodesh, that the Kohanim were not permitted to sleep in their sacred garments. Shenahu dela, sleeping it was not permitted. Ha mechal achli, but eating, it seemed to be that they were permitted to eat in them. Dilma shani achila, perhaps eating is different. Tzorech avodahi, because that may be part of the avoda, part of the worship. In other words, certain aspects, certain kinds of offerings, right? The Kohen had to eat from it. Why? Titania, taught in the Braita, v'achlu otam asher kupar bahem, and they will eat from them that which has been atoned through them. Milamed shahakohanim ochlim uba'alim mitkaprim. This would seem to imply that the eating of the Kohanim of these items helps entitle or allow the owners of the animals brought, these owners, to gain their atonement. So the Gemara answers, Sheinahu delo. Sleeping is the one that we say is prohibited. Ha hiluchi, mahalchi. But just walking around while they're wearing the sacred vest garments, that doesn't seem to be a problem. Bedinhu the hiluchi namilo. Okay, and the Gemara then says, actually, okay, it's logical by right. Even just walking around in them really should not be permitted. Okay. We'll go over just a tiny bit. All right. V'seifa itztarichale. Okay. But we need to say it for the end part of the Mishnah. Poshtin u'mekaplin u'manichin tachat rashehem. That where we're told that they remove the sacred garments, they fold them, and they put them down, and they put their place on them. In other words, they use them, so to speak, as a pillow. So the Gemara says, Poshtin u'mekaplin u'manichin otam tachat rashehem. Shamat mina. And we learn from this what? The following. Big day kahuna nitnu lehanot bahen. That clothes are permitted, right? The Kohanim are permitted to benefit from those clothes. It's the sacred garments. Amar Rav Papa, lo tema tachat rashehem. Don't say that they actually place the garments under their heads. Ela ema, I would say, keneged roshehem, that they place it next to or opposite their heads. Amar Rav Mesharshia, and Rav Mesharshia says, Shema'at mina. We learn from this, tefillin min hatzad shapir dami. Okay? That phylacteries on the side of the head when he sleeps is acceptable, is done well. Right?
Well,
Now, why he should be wearing tefillin when he's sleeping? Okay, unless of course it is falls asleep while he's davening. Right? But remember, they wore tefillin all day in that time. And so the Gemara then says, Hachinami mistabra, the keneged rosheim. So too, it's reasonable then to say that it was next to their heads. The isaka da'atach tachat rosheim, because if you thought it was under their heads, v'tepok li mishum klayim, then we would have to derive and deal with the prohibition of kalayim. The ha'ika avnet. Why? Because we have call it the belt, okay, which was made from diverse kinds. Unehinami dinitnu lehanot bahem. This then was also to derive benefit from them. Hamit nahane mikalayim. But that would seem to imply that one could also derive benefit from diverse kinds. Right? And so the Gemara is going to then continue, okay, and try to deal with this issue. And that's where we're going to stop right there today. All right? And wish everybody a good Shabbos. But before we break up, I just need to have clarity.